The man known to history as Idi Amin emerged from a landscape of historical ambiguity, his very beginnings shrouded in disputed narratives and conflicting accounts. Born in the mid-1920s in Uganda, Amin's early life was characterized more by speculation than certainty. Some accounts, including a statement by Amin's own son Hussein, place his year of birth as late as 1928. However, most historians suggest he was most likely born in 1923 or 1924. The precise location of his birth remains equally contested. While some sources hint at Kampala, the capital, as his birthplace, these claims are likely spurious. The more credible narrative places his origins in Koboko, a region in the Muslim-dominated northwestern part of Uganda, near the border of what is now South Sudan. Amin's family background was as complex and multi-layered as the nation from which he emerged. His father, Andreas Nyabire, represents a study in cultural transformation. Some accounts describe him as a member of the Kakwa people who converted from Roman Catholicism to Islam in the early 20th century, subsequently changing his name to Amin Dada. Other sources suggest a different origin, proposing that he was ethnic Nubian, potentially raised as a Muslim from the start. If the Nubian narrative holds true, Amin's paternal lineage might trace back to Sudan, connected to the broader migrations orchestrated by Amin Pasha, a late 19th century Ottoman provincial governor who had ventured as far south as Uganda in the 1880s. Amin's mother, Assa Ate, represents another point of historical uncertainty. Her ethnic identity remains disputed, with possibilities ranging from Kakwa to Lugbara, different peoples inhabiting what is now northern Uganda. What little is known of Amin's childhood suggests a narrative of maternal resilience. His father abandoned the family when Idi was young, leaving Assa to raise her son alone. In the early 1940s, against the backdrop of World War II raging in Italian East Africa and the Maghreb, young Amin attended an Islamic school in Bombo. These formative years would lay the groundwork for a life that would later become synonymous with political volatility and brutal autocracy. The story of Idi Amin cannot be understood without examining the colonial tapestry that birthed modern Uganda, a country more imagined by colonial rulers than organically formed by its diverse inhabitants. The region that would become Uganda was a complex mosaic of ethnic groups, religious beliefs, and cultural identities, artificially bound together by British imperial ambitions. Pre-colonial Uganda was home to a rich diversity of peoples. The Bagandans dominated the southern regions, including the area around Kampala, ruling a significant territorial expanse. However, the landscape was far from homogeneous. Nilotic peoples like the Kakwa and Lugbara inhabited the northern and eastern territories, while substantial Sudanese populations occupied the northwest. Pockets of Kuliak people also dotted the borderlands between eastern Uganda and western Kenya. Religious divisions further complicated the social landscape. Islam had spread southward from Egypt and Sudan, establishing a significant presence in the northern regions. Simultaneously, native Ugandan religious traditions coexisted with growing numbers of Christians, both Roman Catholics and Protestants. This religious plurality would become a critical factor in Uganda's political dynamics. In the late 19th century, British imperial ambitions began to reshape the region. The Ugandan Protectorate, established in 1894, was part of a grand vision to create a continuous stretch of British-controlled territory from Cairo to Cape Town. This colonial project would fundamentally alter the region's social, economic, and political structures. The British colonial regime actively exacerbated internal divisions. They strategically favored Protestant elements among the Bagandans, using them as a proxy to govern the country and effectively marginalize Muslim populations in the north. This calculated approach of divide and rule would have long-lasting repercussions on Uganda's future political landscape. Despite its exploitative nature, colonial rule brought significant changes. The beginnings of a modern infrastructure emerged, particularly in economic sectors. Cash crops like sugar and cotton became pivotal, and literacy levels saw considerable improvement during the first half of the 20th century. A crucial development was the creation of a native Ugandan military. The British began training and arming local Ugandans in the early 20th century, a process that accelerated during World War I. The King's African Rifles, KAR, would become a critical institution through which figures like Amin would later emerge as significant political actors. In 1946, at approximately 22 or 23 years of age, Idi Amin embarked on a military career that would ultimately reshape Uganda's destiny. His entry into the King's African Rifles, KAR, marked the beginning of a trajectory that would transition from a promising military career to dictatorial rule. Amin would later fabricate claims of fighting in World War II on the Burma front against the Japanese, a narrative entirely of his own creation. The reality was far more straightforward. He was a native Ugandan soldier rising through colonial military ranks. His ascent was remarkable. British officers found him both popular and impressive, particularly noting his athletic abilities and solid work as a soldier. The colonial military structure, with its inherent racial limitations, meant that promotions for African soldiers were typically slow. Yet Amin navigated these constraints with exceptional skill. By the late 1940s, Amin was stationed in neighboring Kenya, a region experiencing more significant agitation against British colonial rule. This placement would prove pivotal in his military development. In 1952, Amin was present during the Kenya Land and Freedom Army's Mau Mau revolt against British imperial rule. He served with distinction in this campaign, though he would later attempt to downplay his involvement in a conflict designed to defend British imperial interests. His military performance was noted by his superiors. Ian Graham, Amin's commanding officer in the KAR, would later claim that Amin was one of the best soldiers and mid-ranking officers he had ever commanded, an assessment shared by other British officers. During these years, Amin was sent to Europe for additional military training. His time in Stirling, Scotland would leave a lasting impression, sparking an unusual affinity for the country that would later manifest in bizarre fantasies of becoming the King of Scotland. By 1959, Amin had achieved the title of Effendi or Afande in Swahili, making him a Class II warrant officer, the highest rank an African could attain within the British Armed Forces in East Africa. However, even during these formative years, indicators of Amin's potential for violence emerged. In late 1961 and early 1962, during interventions to stop cattle raiding on the Uganda-Kenya border, Amin commanded his platoon to massacre scores of villagers. His escape from court-martial was not due to innocence, but political expediency. With Uganda on the brink of independence, the colonial governor Sir Frederick Crawford was reluctant to create a scandal surrounding one of only two native Ugandan commissioned officers. The mid-20th century was a period of profound transformation across Africa, with colonial powers gradually relinquishing their grip on territories that had been under their control for generations. Uganda's journey to independence was part of this broader continental narrative of decolonization. In 1941, the Western Allies had agreed to the Atlantic Charter, which promised greater independence for colonial territories. This, combined with the economic and political exhaustion of European powers following World War II, set the stage for widespread African independence movements. By 1945, the vast majority of the African continent was controlled by European powers: France in the north and northwest, Britain in the south and east, Belgium in the Congo, Portugal in Mozambique and Angola, and Italy in the Horn of Africa and Libya. The pressure for independence became increasingly difficult to resist. By the 1950s, the momentum was unstoppable. In 1956, Morocco and Tunisia gained independence from France, and the process rapidly accelerated. The year 1960 saw multiple French colonies gaining independence, including Cameroon, Senegal, Mali, and others. Uganda's path to independence differed from many other African nations. While countries like Ghana and Nigeria had developed coherent pro-independence political movements with leaders educated in London or Paris, Uganda's political landscape was far more fragmented. By the late 1950s, Uganda lacked a mature political environment. The absence of a unified independence movement would have significant consequences for the country's future political stability. On October 9, 1962, the Republic of Uganda was officially established. Almost immediately, three major political parties emerged. The Democratic Party, representing the Catholic population, the Ugandan People's Congress, largely representing Nilotic peoples of the north, Kabaka Yeka, a Bagandan nationalist party. The first post-independence elections saw the Ugandan People's Congress and Kabaka Yeka form an alliance to exclude the Democratic Party from power. Milton Obote, leader of the UPC, became Uganda's first prime minister. Obote's tenure was immediately challenged by the fundamental problem facing many post-colonial African states: uniting a country that was an artificial construct with numerous ethnic peoples and religious groups. The mid-1960s saw a critical conflict between those advocating for a decentralized federal state, where different ethnic groups could largely govern themselves, and those pushing for a powerful centralized state governed from Kampala. This tension would culminate in February 1966 when Obote suspended the constitution and assumed extensive powers, effectively establishing a dictatorship. However, this was not an uncommon occurrence in post-independence Africa, where strongmen were seizing power across the continent. For Idi Amin, Obote's consolidation of power proved unexpectedly beneficial. Throughout the early years of independence, Amin continued his meteoric rise within the Ugandan armed forces. His promotions were swift and strategic: captain at independence in 1962, major in 1963, deputy commander of the military in 1964, and by 1965, at just 40 years old, he became one of the army's commanders. The pinnacle came in 1970 when Amin reached the summit of military power, appointed as overall commander of Uganda's armed forces. However, this ascent was not merely a result of military merit, but was fundamentally secured through his complicity in Obote's corrupt dealings. The mid-1960s saw Amin deeply involved in a lucrative gold and ivory smuggling operation between Congo and Uganda. While some of these activities were ostensibly intended to arm separatists and rebels in the Congo, a significant portion of the proceeds were simply purloined by Obote, Amin, and their accomplices. The discovery of these smuggling activities in 1966 was central to Obote's decision to seize absolute power that same year. By the late 1960s, Amin had become one of the most powerful individuals in Uganda. Despite their close association, Amin was simultaneously conspiring to seize power himself. His strategy was calculated and methodical. He began hiring extensive numbers of troops from the Kakwa and Nubi areas of northern Uganda, his own ethnic people and fellow Muslims. By systematically filling the Ugandan military with soldiers and officers from these regions, Amin was consolidating his control of the army in preparation for a potential power grab. Moreover, Amin was carefully courting support from Britain and Israel. Britain, concerned about Obote's perceived socialist policies in the context of the Cold War, and Israel, seeking strategic positioning in the region, became potential allies in Amin's political machinations. In October 1970, Obote, growing suspicious of Amin's intentions, removed him from overall command of the Ugandan military and appointed himself to the role. He began preparing charges of financial misconduct against Amin, but moved too slowly, a fatal error. Amin, learning of Obote's intentions, moved aggressively. On January 25, 1971, while Obote was attending a Commonwealth Nations meeting in Singapore, Amin launched a military coup. Kampala was quickly secured, as were critical communication outlets like radio stations. Amin presented himself as a constitutional restorer, claiming he would hold power only temporarily before returning to democratic governance. Obote was forced into exile in neighboring Tanzania, where he would remain throughout the 1970s. What followed was 8 years of one of Africa's most brutal dictatorships, a period that would fundamentally transform Uganda's political, social, and economic landscape. In the weeks following his nearly bloodless coup, Amin swiftly consolidated his control. On February 2, 1971, he declared himself president of Uganda and reappointed himself as overall commander of the armed forces. The new regime rapidly morphed into a military dictatorship, with any pretense of constitutional governance quickly evaporating. Military tribunals broadly replaced the existing court system. Amin's followers within the army were appointed to senior political and civil positions, roles for which they typically had no training. He renamed the government headquarters in Kampala the command post, signaling a new era of military governance. To secure his power, Amin undertook extensive purges of both military and civilian sectors. Thousands of individuals were removed from their positions and replaced by committed adherents to his military government. These removals were not merely administrative, they often involved executions, marking the beginning of the massive bloodletting that would characterize Amin's regime throughout the 1970s. Surprisingly, Amin's initial regime was greeted with open arms by the international community. Both the British and Israelis had supported the 1971 coup, quickly recognizing Amin's government. They believed the former KAR officer would be easier to manage than Obote. Amin eagerly encouraged these delusions, presenting himself as a potential reconciler of Uganda's complex political, ethnic, and religious problems. In July 1971, he was welcomed on state visits to both Britain and Israel, meeting Prime Minister Edward Heath and even lunching at Buckingham Palace. During his British visit, Amin returned to Scotland, where he had trained in the 1950s. He developed a peculiar affection for the country, later giving several of his sons Scottish names and even dressing a regiment of the Ugandan army in kilts. In a bizarre twist, he would later entertain notions of becoming the King of Scotland. However, the veneer of respectability quickly cracked. In July 1971, while Amin was dining at Buckingham Palace, two Americans, journalist Nicholas Stroh and sociology lecturer Robert Seidel, were murdered at army barracks while investigating political killings. An American investigation led by David Jeffries Jones quickly determined the murders were committed by Amin's men. Jones fled the country in fear before completing his investigation. This incident was the first serious indication that Amin would not be the reliable strongman the West had hoped for. Rebuffed in his requests for additional arms by London and Tel Aviv, Amin turned to more controversial allies. He approached Colonel Muammar al-Gaddafi of Libya, a leader who had established himself in opposition to former colonial powers. To win Gaddafi's support, Amin presented a fantastical view of Uganda. He claimed that 70% of Uganda's population was Muslim, when the actual number was closer to 6%. Gaddafi was convinced, and Amin brought Uganda into the Organization of Islamic States, promising to limit Christian religious freedoms in exchange for weapons. By 1972, the violence unleashed by the Amin regime had begun to intensify dramatically. The primary targets were the Acholi and Lango ethnic groups who opposed Amin's rule. By early 1972, at least 5,000 individuals had disappeared, including soldiers, lawyers, students, religious leaders, and local political figures. Bodies were frequently found floating in the River Nile, a grim testament to the regime's brutality. Amin's most notorious action came in autumn 1972, with the expulsion of Uganda's Asian population. This was not a spontaneous decision, but a calculated economic and political strategy. Asian communities, particularly those of Indian descent, had dominated Uganda's commercial landscape, controlling 80–90% of trade and industry. On August 4, 1972, Amin announced that non-citizen Asians would have to leave the country within 90 days. This created an immediate humanitarian and diplomatic crisis. The British government, which had promised citizenship to Asians at independence, found itself scrambling to respond. A United Nations emergency airlift was required to bring 27,000 Ugandan refugees of Asian descent to Britain. The expulsion was accompanied by widespread looting, with those being forced out robbed of virtually everything of value. The consequences were devastating. The 50,000, 60,000 Asian Ugandans who were expelled had been the economic backbone of the country. Businesses were handed over to Amin's military followers, individuals typically lacking basic literacy and business skills. Farm machinery broke down and remained unfixed. Cotton gins stopped working. Cement factories in Toro and Fort Portal collapsed. By 1975-1976, the Ugandan economy had effectively imploded. Shortages became widespread, inflation skyrocketed, and economic infrastructure crumbled. Amin's international relationships became increasingly erratic. By the end of 1972, most Britons had left Uganda. In 1974, he expelled 14 members of the British High Commission. Despite growing Western sanctions, bizarrely, planes continued flying from Stansted Airport in London, carrying luxury goods for Amin and his regime, the so-called Whiskey Run, operating outside official trade restrictions. The dictator simultaneously turned to Libya and the Soviet Union for support, denouncing Western powers and Israel. By the end of 1975, Moscow had provided millions in economic and military aid, and Amin had dispatched thousands of Ugandan troops to Eastern Europe for military training. Amin's regime systematically favored certain religious and ethnic groups. Despite Muslims comprising only about 6% of the population, they occupied over 80% of top military and government positions by the late 1970s. Conversely, groups like the Aholi and Langi faced persistent persecution. The State Research Bureau, under the leadership of Bob Astel, became an instrument of terror. This secret police organization was responsible for the disappearance of thousands, with forced car trunk abductions becoming a terrifyingly common sight in Kampala. Amin's personal behavior became increasingly erratic. An alleged sufferer of advanced syphilis, he may have been experiencing partial dementia. His lifestyle became more extravagant. He was a polygamist with up to 50 children, hosting lavish weddings and acquiring multiple palaces. His mental state deteriorated to the point of sending a telegram to UN Secretary-General Kurt Waldheim praising Adolf Hitler, seemingly suggesting the Holocaust was carried out by setting people on fire with gas, a message that further isolated him internationally. By the late 1970s, Amin's regime had begun to crumble from within. A significant split emerged in the Ugandan military between those loyal to Amin and those supporting Vice President Mustafa Adrisi. This internal fracture would prove decisive in Amin's ultimate downfall. In 1978, Amin made a fateful decision to transform a localized military incident into a full-scale war with Tanzania. When troops loyal to Adrisi mutinied in southern Uganda near the Tanzanian border, Amin saw an opportunity to consolidate his power by initiating a broader conflict. Initially, the war seemed to favor Amin. Ugandan forces entered northern Tanzania and occupied the region. By the end of 1978, Amin boldly announced his intention to annex the Kagera region of northern Tanzania. The situation changed dramatically in January 1979. Tanzanian President Julius Nyerere mobilized the Tanzanian People's Defense Force to strike back. They were joined by a large contingent of Ugandan exiles who had been living in Tanzania and opposed Amin's regime. The exiled forces included Yoweri Museveni, who would play a significant role in Uganda's future political landscape. As the Tanzanian and exile forces moved north, Amin's military began to disintegrate. Some units fled across the western border into Congo, while others were systematically defeated. Amin frantically sought international support. He appealed to Saudi Arabia and Saddam Hussein's Iraq, but received only minimal assistance from Gaddafi in Libya and the Palestinian Liberation Organization. The critical engagement came at the Battle of Lukaya, southwest of Kampala, on March 1979. A force of 2,000 Ugandan troops and 1,000 Libyans, supported by 18 tanks, was overwhelmed by a joint Tanzanian and Ugandan Exile army with superior infantry numbers. In the aftermath of this defeat, many urged Amin to step down. However, he remained defiant, even firing his military chief of staff, Yusuf Gowon. As Tanzanian and Exile troops closed in on Entebbe airport, Amin finally fled Kampala by helicopter on April 11, 1979, a date marking the official end of his regime. Amin first sought refuge in Libya with his old ally Gaddafi. By 1980, he had settled in Jeddah, Saudi Arabia, where he was given official sanctuary. In his first post-rule interview, he ludicrously claimed that many in Uganda wished for his return to power. In 1989, Amin attempted to return to Uganda, flying to Zaire during a period of regional conflict. He hoped to use the disorder to build support for his comeback. The mission failed, and he was quickly returned to Saudi Arabia. The remainder of Amin's life was spent in relative obscurity in Jeddah. He was warned against giving interviews or speaking to the press. His days were filled with mundane activities, sports events, gym sessions, and shopping trips in his Range Rover or Chevrolet Caprice. In 2003, Amin fell into a coma due to kidney failure. His family's request to return to Uganda was denied, with the promise of prosecution if he set foot in the country. On August 16, 2003, he died in Jeddah and was buried in a nondescript grave. Estimates suggest Amin's regime was responsible for at least 300,000 deaths, with some census records indicating a population decline of up to 800,000. His rule represented one of the most brutal dictatorships in African history, marked by ethnic persecution, economic devastation, and widespread human rights abuses. The aftermath of Amin's regime was far from a simple return to stability. A loose civilian government was quickly formed, but it proved ineffective and deeply divided. By May 1980, another military coup had occurred, leading to an interim military government under Paulo Mwanga. Unlike Amin's seizure of power, Mwanga's leadership paved the way for elections and a transition to civilian government. Milton Obote returned to power, resuming the presidency he had lost in 1971. However, this return was not without controversy. Many groups believed the 1980 elections had been rigged in Obote's favor. This suspicion sparked the Ugandan Bush War, a prolonged guerrilla conflict led by Yoweri Museveni. The war would continue for over 5 years, highlighting the ongoing political instability that had plagued Uganda since independence. By 1985, Obote was once again forced into exile. In January 1986, Museveni's guerrilla fighters entered Kampala, and Museveni became president, a position he would hold for decades to come. Amin's rise and fall offered a stark commentary on the failures of decolonization in Africa. He had been trained by the British, rose through the King's African Rifles, and committed atrocities even before independence. Yet, colonial authorities chose to overlook these issues for political expediency. The international community, including Britain and Israel, had initially supported Amin, believing he would be easier to manage than Obote. This geopolitical short-sightedness facilitated the rise of one of Africa's most brutal dictators. The human cost of Amin's regime was immense. While precise figures are difficult to determine, estimates suggest at least 300,000 people were killed directly by the regime. The economic devastation was equally profound. The expulsion of Asian traders and the subsequent mismanagement had reduced Uganda's once promising economy to ruins. Amin's rule had exacerbated ethnic and religious divisions within Uganda. His strategy of favoring certain groups while persecuting others created deep social wounds that would take generations to heal. The Muslim minority, despite comprising only 6% of the population, had been elevated to dominant positions. Amin's regime became a cautionary tale of how quickly a military officer can transform from a promising leader to a brutal dictator. His story illustrated the dangers of unchecked power, the manipulation of ethnic tensions, and the potential for personal megalomania to destroy a nation. Ironically, the hope for democratic change represented by Museveni's rise would itself become problematic. Museveni has remained in power since 1986, becoming one of the world's longest-serving heads of state. Human rights abuses and minority persecution continued, suggesting that the structural issues that enabled Amin's rise remained deeply embedded in Uganda's political system. Amin's story is more than just a biography of a single dictator. It represents a critical chapter in understanding post-colonial African politics, a narrative of artificial national boundaries, colonial legacies, ethnic complexity, and the challenges of nation-building in a continent emerging from imperial rule. His regime serves as a powerful reminder of how geopolitical interests, personal ambition, and systemic vulnerabilities can combine to create conditions for extreme human suffering. The story of Idi Amin is ultimately a profound meditation on the complex dynamics of power, identity, and national transformation in post-colonial Africa. His regime represents more than just a personal descent into madness. It is a stark illustration of the broader systemic failures that characterized many African nations in the mid-20th century. Amin did not emerge in a vacuum. He was, in many ways, a product of colonial engineering, trained by the British, promoted through a military system designed to maintain imperial control, and ultimately elevated to power through a combination of international political maneuvering and internal national fragmentation. While estimates vary, the human cost of Amin's regime is staggering. At least 300,000 people were directly killed, with some demographic analyses suggesting a population decline of up to 800,000. Beyond the numbers, each represented a shattered life, a destroyed family, a community torn apart. The international community's role cannot be overlooked. Britain, Israel, and other global powers supported Amin, believing they could manipulate him to serve their Cold War interests. This cynical calculation resulted in immense human suffering, demonstrating how geopolitical expediency can have devastating humanitarian consequences. Uganda's trajectory after Amin reveals the enduring challenges of post-colonial state formation. The subsequent leadership of Yoweri Museveni, while initially promising, has itself become another example of prolonged authoritarian rule. The fundamental issues of ethnic division, military interference in politics, and systemic corruption remain unresolved. Amin's story is not just a historical curiosity, but a stark warning. It illustrates how quickly democratic institutions can collapse, how ethnic and religious divisions can be weaponized for political control, and how individual megalomaniacal tendencies can destroy an entire nation's potential. Perhaps most chillingly, Amin's trajectory demonstrates the potential for brutality that exists within human systems. From a promising military officer to one of Africa's most notorious dictators, his journey reveals the thin line between order and chaos, between leadership and tyranny. For Uganda, the legacy of Amin represents an ongoing process of healing and understanding. Each retelling of this history is an opportunity to examine the roots of political violence, to understand how societies can protect themselves from similar futures, and to honor the memories of those who suffered. While Amin's story is uniquely Ugandan, it resonates far beyond the borders of a single nation. It speaks to broader global discussions about colonialism, power, ethnic identity, and the challenges of creating just and inclusive political systems. As new generations of Ugandans and global citizens engage with this history, the hope remains that understanding such dark chapters can help prevent their repetition. Education, empathy, robust democratic institutions, and a commitment to human rights offer the most powerful antidotes to the kind of systematic oppression Amin embodied. Idi Amin died in exile in 2003, far from the scene of his crimes, never fully held to account. Yet history has rendered its judgment. He remains a symbol of political brutality, a cautionary tale of how power unchecked can lead to unimaginable human suffering. In the end, his most lasting legacy is not what he did, but what he teaches us about the fragility of human societies and the constant vigilance required to protect human dignity.